The sound of a pistol firing echoed through the valley as Brielle Kincaid watched her father's casket being lowered into the ground. The traditional three-shot salute, marking the passing of one of Lewiston's most respected ranchers. The year was 1885, and at 22 years old, Brielle had never imagined she would be burying her father and fighting to keep their family ranch, the Lazy K, all in the same month. Miss Kincaid, the banker, Mr. Hollister, approached her as the small crowd began to disperse. His polished boots seemed out of place among the dusty ground of the cemetery. "I'm truly sorry for your loss, but I must remind you that the matter of your father's debts remains unresolved." Brielle clutched the folded American flag to her chest, her blue eyes hardening as she stared at the banker. The June sun beat down mercilessly on her black mourning dress, and sweat trickled down her back. "My father isn't even in the ground yet, Mr. Hollister," she said through clenched teeth. "The bank has been more than patient, Miss Kincaid. Your father took out loans against the property for the last 3 seasons, with the drought and the cattle fever that decimated your herd." He adjusted his spectacles, looking uncomfortable but determined. "The bank requires payment of $2,000 by the end of the month, or I'm afraid we'll have to foreclose on the property." $2,000. Brielle's voice rose, drawing the attention of the remaining mourners. "That's impossible, and you know it." Her best friend, Mary Sutton, appeared at her side, taking her arm. "Brielle, let's get you home. This isn't the time or place." Hollister nodded stiffly. "I'll stop by the ranch tomorrow with the paperwork. Again, my condolences." As he walked away, Brielle fought back tears of frustration. Her father had kept the extent of their financial troubles from her, protecting her until the very end. Now, she had less than 3 weeks to save the only home she'd ever known. The small procession of wagons and riders made their way back to the Lazy K Ranch, nestled in a green valley just outside Lewiston. The 2-story farmhouse, weathered but proud, stood against a backdrop of rolling hills and pine forests. To Brielle, it was the most beautiful place on earth. Mary helped her down from the wagon, concern etched on her freckled face. "You're staying with me tonight. No arguments." "I can't," Brielle said, removing her black gloves. "There's work to be done here. The ranch will still be here tomorrow." Mary squeezed her hand. "You shouldn't be alone tonight." Brielle shook her head. "I need to go through Pa's papers, see if there's something I'm missing. There must be a way out of this mess." The few ranch hands who remained, only old Pete and young Jimmy, tipped their hats as they headed toward the bunkhouse. The ranch had once employed a dozen men, but as finances had dwindled, so had their workforce. "At least let me help," Mary offered, following Brielle inside. The house felt eerily quiet without her father's booming laugh or heavy footsteps. Brielle moved through the familiar rooms, touching the handmade furniture her father had crafted, the quilt her mother had sewn before she died of consumption when Brielle was just 12. Every corner held memories that threatened to drown her. In her father's study, Brielle lit the oil lamp and began sorting through the drawers of his desk. Bills, receipts, and letters revealed the story her father had kept hidden: 3 years of drought, falling cattle prices, and loans taken to keep them afloat. "It's worse than Hollister let on," she said, showing Mary the bank notices. "Pa was behind on payments for months. Even if I sell everything we own, it won't be enough." "What about your aunt in San Francisco?" Mary suggested. "Could she help?" Brielle shook her head. "She hasn't spoken to Pa since Mother died, and I wouldn't ask for her charity even if she would give it." She straightened her shoulders. "The Kincaids have run this ranch for 30 years. I won't be the one to lose it." That night, after Mary reluctantly left, Brielle sat on the porch swing, watching the stars come out over the land that had shaped her. She'd grown up learning to ride before she could walk, helping with branding and roundups, absorbing everything her father taught her about ranching. But none of that had prepared her for this. "I won't let them take you," she whispered to the night air. "Somehow I'll find a way." The next morning, Brielle rose before dawn, donned her work clothes, and set out to assess what remained of their operation. 20 head of cattle, 2 working horses, some chickens, and a VEGE-1E6D a BLE garden that needed tending. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Old Pete found her in the barn, brushing down her mare, Penny. "Miss Brielle," he said, hat in hand. "Jimmy and me, we've been talking. We want you to know we're staying on, wages or no." Tears sprang to her eyes. "Pete, I can't ask that of you." "Ain't asking. Your pa was good to us when times were hard. Besides," he grinned, showing his missing tooth, "where would 2 old cowhands like us go anyway?" Brielle impulsively hugged the weathered cowboy, who patted her back awkwardly. "Thank you," she said. "With your help, maybe we can still turn things around." But as the days passed, reality set in. The cattle they had left wouldn't fetch enough at market. The fields needed planting, but they had no seed money. And every day the deadline loomed closer. Desperate, Brielle rode into Lewiston, hoping to find work or someone willing to lend money on better terms than the bank. The main street bustled with activity, freight wagons loading supplies for the mining camps up north. Cowboys fresh off the trail spending their pay in saloons, and ladies in fashionable dresses window shopping. Brielle tied Penny outside the general store and went inside, approaching the owner, Mr. Thompson. "I need work, Mr. Thompson," she said without preamble. "Any kind of work." The shopkeeper looked uncomfortable. "Miss Kincaid, I was mighty sorry to hear about your father. He was a good man." "Thank you, but I didn't come for condolences. I came for a job." Thompson shifted his weight. "Well now, I don't rightly have any positions open, and even if I did—" He trailed off, unwilling to state the obvious that a young woman of her standing wasn't expected to work for wages. "I'm strong, I can read and figure better than most, and I'm willing to do whatever is needed," Brielle pressed. "Have you tried the hotel? Mrs. Warner sometimes needs help with laundry." Brielle thanked him and left, her pride stinging but her determination undiminished. She spent the day going from business to business, facing the same polite refusals or offers of charity she couldn't accept. At the hotel, Mrs. Warner did offer her work washing bedsheets for pennies a day. It wasn't nearly enough, but Brielle accepted. She'd take anything at this point. As she was leaving the hotel, a commotion in the street caught her attention. A group of cowboys had ridden into town, trail dust still clinging to their clothes. They were a rowdy bunch, laughing and calling to each other as they dismounted in front of the saloon. One man stood out from the rest, taller, broader in the shoulders, with an air of quiet authority. As he turned, Brielle caught a glimpse of his face under the brim of his hat, strong-jawed, sun-bronzed, with eyes the color of a storm cloud. Something about him seemed vaguely familiar, though she was certain they'd never met. She was still watching when he glanced up and caught her eye. For a moment, they stared at each other across the busy street. Then one of his companions called out, "Come on, York. First round's on you." The man, York, tipped his hat to her before disappearing into the saloon. Brielle shook herself out of her daze and mounted Penny for the ride home. She had more important things to worry about than handsome cowboys. The next day, Hollister arrived at the ranch with paperwork in hand. He sat at the kitchen table, uncomfortably perched on the edge of his chair while Brielle made coffee. "I'm afraid there's no extension possible, Miss Kincaid," he said, responding to her request for more time. "The bank has investors to answer to. We've already been more lenient with your father than we should have been." "Because you knew he was dying," Brielle said bluntly. setting a cup in front of him with more force than necessary. "You let him dig himself deeper knowing you'd get the land in the end." Hollister had the grace to look ashamed. "Business is business, Miss Kincaid. The land will be auctioned within a week of foreclosure. You'll have 3 days after that to vacate the premises." "And where am I supposed to go?" she demanded. "I understand your aunt in San Francisco." "No." The word was final. Hollister sighed. "The bank will allow you to keep your personal belongings and one wagon to transport them. Your father's personal debts are considered settled with the forfeit of the property." "How generous," Brielle said bitterly. After Hollister left, Brielle saddled Penny and rode out to the highest point on the ranch. From there, she could see the entire valley, the creek that ran through the property, the meadows where cattle grazed, the pine forest that had provided timber for their house. Her father was buried on this land, alongside her mother. The thought of strangers owning it, perhaps tearing down the house or cutting down the trees, was unbearable. She was still sitting there when the sun began to set, painting the valley in gold and crimson. The beauty of it broke something inside her, and for the first time since her father's death, she allowed herself to cry deep, racking sobs that shook her entire body. When she finally composed herself, the moon was rising. Brielle wiped her face, squared her shoulders, and rode back down to the house. Crying wouldn't save the ranch. Nothing would, it seemed, but she would fight until the very end. The following days fell into a grueling routine. Brielle rose before dawn to tend to the ranch chores, rode into town to wash hotel linens until her hands were raw, then returned home to work until dark. Pete and Jimmy helped as best they could, but they were both getting on in years, and there was simply too much for 3 people to manage. On her 3rd day at the hotel, Brielle was carrying a basket of wet sheets to the drying line when she collided with someone coming around the corner. The basket tumbled, and the clean sheets spilled onto the dusty ground. "I'm so sorry, miss," a deep voice said as strong hands steadied her. Brielle looked up to find herself face to face with the cowboy she'd seen days earlier. York. Up close, she could see the flecks of blue in his gray eyes and the small scar that ran along his jawline. "No harm done," she said, kneeling to gather the now soiled sheets. "Except that I'll have to wash these all over again." He immediately knelt to help her. "Please let me. It was my fault entirely." His hands were calloused but gentle as he carefully folded the sheets back into the basket. There was something in the way he moved, efficient, deliberate, that suggested he was a man accustomed to hard work despite the quality of his clothes and the silver concho on his belt. "Do I know you?" Brielle asked, tilting her head. "You seem familiar somehow." A shadow passed over his face. "I don't believe we've formally met. York Calloway." He extended his hand. "Brielle Kincaid." She shook his hand, noting his firm grip. Recognition flickered in his eyes. "Kincaid, from the Lazy K Ranch." "Yes," she said, suddenly wary. "Do you know it? I've passed by. Fine piece of land." He hesitated. "I heard about your father. My condolences." "Thank you." Brielle picked up her basket. "If you'll excuse me, Mr. Calloway, I have laundry to rewash." "Of course." He stepped aside but then called after her, "Miss Kincaid." She turned back. "If you don't mind my asking, why is the owner of the Lazy K washing sheets at the Lewiston Hotel?" The question, though gently asked, hit a raw nerve. "Because, Mr. Calloway, the owner of the Lazy K is trying to save her home from foreclosure." "Good day." She walked away, back straight and head high, though her cheeks burned with humiliation. She didn't see York Calloway watching her go, a thoughtful expression on his face. That evening, as Brielle was leaving the hotel, Mrs. Warner called her into the office. "Your week's wages, dear," she said, handing Brielle a few coins. "And, well, there's something else." She reached into her desk and pulled out an envelope. "A gentleman left this for you, most unusual." Brielle took the envelope, puzzled. Her name was written across the front in a strong, slanted hand. "Who left it?" "That tall cowboy who's been staying here. Calloway, I believe his name is." Curious, Brielle opened it once she was outside. Inside was a folded piece of paper and, to her shock, $100 bill. The note read simply, "Miss Kincaid, please accept this as payment for a debt long owed to your family. No strings attached. Y.C." Brielle stared at the money, her hands trembling. $100 was a fortune, enough to buy seed for planting or a few head of cattle, but nowhere near enough to save the ranch. And what debt could York Calloway possibly owe her family? She'd never heard her father mention the name. Her first instinct was to find him and return the money. Pride demanded it, but practicality won out. She couldn't afford to turn away help, even from a mysterious source. She tucked the envelope into her pocket and mounted Penny for the ride home, her mind racing with questions about York Calloway and what connection he might have to her family. The next day, Brielle didn't go to town. Instead, she rode out to survey the farthest boundaries of the ranch, memorizing every creek and hillock, every stand of trees and patch of wildflowers. If these were to be her last days here, she wanted to carry the memory of every inch with her. As she crested a rise overlooking the north pasture, she spotted a rider approaching from the direction of town. The sun glinted off something silver on his belt, a concho. York Calloway. Brielle's pulse quickened as she urged Penny down the slope to intercept him. He saw her coming and reined in his horse, a magnificent black stallion that made Penny look like a pony in comparison. "Mr. Calloway," she called as she drew near, "I believe you're trespassing on Kincaid land." He smiled, showing white teeth against his tanned face. "My apologies, Miss Kincaid. I was hoping to speak with you. About the money." She pulled Penny to a stop beside him. "I can't accept it without knowing why you're giving it to me." York looked out over the pasture, his expression unreadable. "It's a long story. I have time." She gestured to a nearby oak tree. "Shall we?" They dismounted and tied their horses in the shade. Brielle sat on a flat rock while York remained standing, hat in hand, revealing thick dark hair with a slight wave to it. "I knew your father," he began, "though he wouldn't have remembered me. I was just a boy when we met." "When was this?" Brielle asked. 1868, just after the war." York's gaze turned distant. "My father was killed at Gettysburg. My mother and I were traveling west with a wagon train, hoping to start fresh in Oregon. We had nothing but the clothes on our backs and a few supplies." He paused, twisting his hat in his hands. "About 10 miles east of here, our wagon broke an axle. The train couldn't wait. Indians had been spotted in the area. They left us behind with promises to send help." "And my father was that help," Brielle guessed, beginning to understand. York nodded. "He found us on the second day, half-starved and terrified. He brought us here to the Lazy K, fixed our wagon, fed us, let us stay until my mother recovered her strength." His voice softened. "He wouldn't take a penny for his trouble, though we had little to give anyway." "That sounds like Pa," Brielle said, a lump forming in her throat. "Before we left, he gave me something." York reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn pocket knife. "Said a boy should have a good blade. Told me to pass on the kindness someday." Brielle recognized the knife, her grandfather's, with the worn wooden handle her father had always treasured. "He gave you his father's knife." "I didn't know its value then," York admitted, "but I never forgot what he did for us. When I heard he'd passed and that the ranch was in trouble." He shrugged. "It seemed time to repay that debt." "With $100, Brielle raised an eyebrow. "That's quite a repayment for hospitality and a pocket knife." York had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. It's all I could spare at the moment. Something about his tone made Brielle curious. What do you do, Mr. Calloway, that you can spare $100 so easily? I raise horses, he said. Up in Montana Territory, I'm down here to buy stock. The pieces fell into place. You're that Calloway, of the Double C Ranch, he nodded, seeming surprised she'd heard of it. Your Appaloosas won at the Territorial Fair last year, Brielle said. The Double C was known throughout the Northwest for its fine horseflesh. My father and I went to watch the races. We did well, York acknowledged modestly. Well enough that $100 is pocket change, apparently, Brielle said, torn between gratitude and embarrassment at accepting charity from a man who'd clearly done very well for himself. Not pocket change, York corrected her. But I owe your father more than money could repay. My mother and I might not have survived without his help, and everything I have now. He gestured vaguely. It might never have been. Brielle considered him thoughtfully. There was no deceit in his eyes, only genuine appreciation for what her father had done all those years ago. Still, pride made her hesitate. I appreciate the sentiment, Mr. Calloway, but the bank wants $2,000, not $100. Even with your generous gift, I'm still going to lose the ranch. York's expression darkened. $2,000. That's highway robbery for a place this size. It's the accumulated debt plus interest, Brielle explained. The drought hit us hard the last few years, and then cattle fever took half our herd. Pa had to borrow to keep us going. And the bank knew he was ill, York asked, his jaw tightening. They knew. Brielle stood, dusting off her skirt. But as Mr. Hollister says, business is business. York was silent for a long moment, his eyes scanning the ranch, taking in the faded paint on the distant barn, the broken fence that needed mending, the sparse herd of cattle grazing in the lower pasture. Finally, he turned back to her. What would you do, Miss Kincaid, if you could keep the ranch? The question caught her off guard. Do, to make it profitable again, he clarified. What would be your plan? Brielle hadn't allowed herself to think that far ahead, but the answer came readily. I'd diversify. Pa was stubborn about staying with cattle, but this land is good for other things too. Horses, like you raise, maybe some sheep on the North Ridge. The creek could irrigate more fields if we dug proper channels. She surprised herself with how much she'd thought about it. The timber on the north side could be selectively harvested without destroying the forest, and the old line shack by the pass could be expanded into a way station for travelers heading to the mining camps. York was watching her with undisguised admiration. You've given this some thought. Daydreams, Brielle said, embarrassed by her enthusiasm. It doesn't matter now. It matters, York said firmly. And I'd like to help if you'll let me. Brielle tensed. I appreciate the offer, Mr. Calloway, but I can't accept more charity. Not charity, he said quickly. A business proposition. What kind of business proposition? She asked warily. A partnership of sorts. York spoke carefully, as if measuring each word. I provide the funds to clear the debt and make initial improvements. You provide the land and the knowledge of how to work it. We split the profits once the ranch is producing again. Brielle stared at him, stunned. You'd invest $2,000 in a ranch you barely know, run by a woman you just met. I know good land when I see it, York said simply. And I know your father raised a daughter who understands ranching. Besides, he added with a slight smile, I've been looking to expand south anyway. It was too good to be true. Brielle had learned the hard way that nothing came without a price. And what would you expect in return, beyond a share of hypothetical future profits? York looked her directly in the eye. Only your word that you'll work as hard as I will to make this place succeed. That's it, Brielle pressed, suspicious. That's it. York extended his hand. Partners. Brielle hesitated, studying his face for any sign of deception. Finding none, she slowly reached out and shook his hand. "I'll need everything in writing, legal and binding." York's smile widened. "I'd expect nothing less. Shall we ride to town and see about drawing up those papers?" And paying a visit to your friend Hollister, for the first time in weeks, Brielle felt a spark of hope. "Mr. Calloway, I think that's the best idea I've heard in a long time." They rode side by side into Lewiston, an unlikely pair that drew curious glances from townspeople. At the bank, Hollister nearly fell out of his chair when York introduced himself and stated his intention to pay off the Kincaid debt in full. "The Double C Ranch is well known to our bank, Mr. Calloway," Hollister said, suddenly solicitous. "But I must express surprise at your interest in the Lazy K. It's been neglected in recent years." "I see potential where others see problems," York replied coolly. "Now, shall we proceed with the transfer? I'd like this concluded today." Hollister's smile faltered slightly. "Of course, though there is the matter of the auction notices already posted." "Tear them down," York said flatly. "I'm afraid once the foreclosure process has begun." York leaned forward, his voice dropping. "Mr. Hollister, I have considerable business interests throughout the territory. The bank that handles those interests should be one that shows flexibility and good faith. Don't you agree?" The thinly veiled threat had its intended effect. Within the hour, the debt was settled, the foreclosure canceled, and new partnership papers drawn up between York Calloway and Brielle Kincaid. As they left the bank, Brielle felt lightheaded with relief and disbelief. "I can't believe we just did that." York offered her his arm as they walked down the boardwalk. "Believe it, partner. The hard work starts tomorrow." "Why are you really doing this?" Brielle asked, unable to shake the feeling that there must be more to his motives. York stopped walking and turned to face her. "Because 17 years ago, your father showed kindness to strangers when he had no reason to. Because good land shouldn't fall into the hands of speculators who'll strip it bare. And," he added more softly, "because I saw something in your eyes that day by the hotel, a fighter who deserved a fair chance." His sincerity was disarming. Brielle found herself believing him despite her reservations. "Thank you," she said simply. "Don't thank me yet," York warned with a smile. "I drive a hard bargain, Miss Kincaid. I expect that ranch to turn a profit within 2 years." "We'll do it in 18 months, Brielle countered, surprising herself with her boldness. York laughed, a rich sound that turned heads on the street. "I believe you will at that. Now, shall we celebrate our partnership with dinner at the hotel? I hear Mrs. Warner serves a fine roast on Thursdays." Brielle glanced down at her work clothes, dusty trousers, and a faded shirt. "I'm hardly dressed for dining." "You look fine to me," York said with a sincerity that brought heat to her cheeks. "But if you prefer, we can ride back to the ranch. I should probably meet Pete and Jimmy anyway, if we're going to be working together." The mention of the ranch hands reminded Brielle of her new reality. York wasn't just a benefactor, he was now her business partner, with a legal claim to half of what had always been solely Kincaid land. The thought was both reassuring and unsettling. "The ranch it is," she decided. "But I should warn you, my cooking isn't as good as Mrs. Warner's. I survived on trail beans for 2 weeks getting down here," York said cheerfully. "Anything hot that isn't beans will taste like heaven." As they rode back to the Lazy K, Brielle felt as if a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The ranch was safe for now. And though York Calloway was still largely a stranger, something told her she could trust him. Her father had been a good judge of character, even when York was just a boy. She hoped that quality had been passed on to her. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. True to his word, York threw himself into the work of reviving the ranch with a passion that matched Brielle's own. He sent for 3 of his own ranch hands from Montana to help with the heavy work, brought in new breeding stock, both cattle and horses, and set about repairing buildings and fences. Brielle, for her part, showed him every corner of the property, sharing her vision for its future. They worked from dawn to dusk, often disagreeing but always finding compromise. York respected her knowledge of the land and listened to her ideas, while contributing his own expertise in horse breeding and business management. One evening, about a month after their partnership began, they sat on the porch after dinner, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. York had just returned from a 3-day trip to purchase supplies in Spokane, and Brielle was surprised by how much she'd missed his company. "The new irrigation channels are working well," she told him, sipping the coffee he'd brought back, a luxury they hadn't had in months. "The north field is already looking greener." "I knew it would," York said, satisfaction evident in his voice. "This land just needed the right touch." He glanced at her. "Your father would be proud of what you're accomplishing here." The mention of her father brought both warmth and a twinge of sadness. "I hope so. Sometimes I wonder if he'd approve of all these changes." "From what you've told me about him, I think he'd appreciate practical improvements," York said. "He seemed a pragmatic man." "He was," Brielle agreed. "Stubborn as a mule sometimes, but practical when it counted." She hesitated, then asked something that had been on her mind. "York, can I ask you something personal?" "Of course." He set his coffee cup down, giving her his full attention. "You're successful, established in Montana. Why come all the way down here to expand? Surely there was land available closer to your home." York was quiet for a moment, watching the last rays of sunlight disappear behind the mountains. "The truth," she nodded. "I never forgot this place," he said softly. "When my mother and I left, I made her stop at the top of the East Ridge so I could look back one more time. I remember thinking it was the most beautiful valley I'd ever seen." He smiled at the memory. "I told her someday I'd have a place just like it." "And now you do," Brielle said. "Half of it anyway. Half is enough." His eyes met hers in the gathering dusk. "More than I ever expected." Something in his gaze made her heart beat faster. In the weeks they'd worked together, Brielle had come to admire York's strength, his intelligence, and his unwavering determination. But there was a gentleness to him as well, the way he handled new foals, his patience with old Pete's rambling stories, the respect he showed her opinions even when they differed from his own. She looked away first, suddenly conscious of how close they were sitting, of the deepening intimacy of their conversation. "It's getting late," she said, rising from her chair. "And we have an early start tomorrow if we're going to begin breaking those new horses." York stood as well, towering over her in the dim light. "Brielle," he said, using her first name as he sometimes did in unguarded moments, "I'm glad I came back here. Not just for the ranch, but—" He trailed off, seemingly unsure how to continue. "I'm glad too," she said softly, meaning it more than she could express. "Good night, York." She slipped inside, her pulse still racing, aware that something had shifted between them, something that went beyond business partnership. The next morning, they were both all business again, focused on the task of gentling the wild mustangs York had purchased from a trapper. These horses, caught in the hills to the north, would form the foundation of their breeding program, hardy stock with good conformation and natural endurance. York proved to be a masterful horse trainer, using patience and gentle persistence rather than force. Brielle watched, fascinated, as he worked with a particularly spirited bay stallion, speaking to it in low tones, gradually accustoming it to human touch. "He's magnificent," she said when York finally led the horse to the corral fence where she was perched. "Worth every penny you paid." "And more," York agreed, patting the stallion's gleaming neck. "He'll sire some fine foals." He gave her an appraising look. "Want to try working with him?" Brielle hesitated. She was an experienced rider, but breaking wild horses had always been her father's domain. "Are you sure? I've seen how you handle that mare of yours," York said. "You have the touch. Come on." He held out his hand to help her down from the fence. She took it, feeling the strength in his grip as he guided her to the stallion's side. "Talk to him first," York instructed, standing close behind her. "Let him get used to your voice." Brielle began speaking softly to the horse, who flicked his ears nervously but stood his ground. "Now, touch his neck just lightly," York said. His breath was warm against her ear, his body a solid presence at her back. She reached out slowly, letting her fingers brush the horse's smooth coat. The stallion quivered but didn't pull away. "That's it," York murmured. His hand came up to cover hers, guiding it along the horse's neck. "He needs to trust you." Brielle was acutely aware of York's proximity, of the mingled sense of leather, horse, and soap that clung to him. Her heart was pounding not from fear of the half-wild horse, but from the intimate gesture of his hand over hers. The stallion suddenly tossed his head, breaking the spell. York stepped back, giving her space. "He likes you," he said with approval. "We'll make a horse trainer of you yet, Miss Kincaid." The moment had passed, but something lingered in the air between them, an awareness that wasn't there before. They spent the rest of the day working with the horses, establishing a rhythm of cooperation that felt as natural as breathing. By sunset, they were dusty, tired, and satisfied with the progress they'd made. As summer turned to autumn, the transformation of the Lazy K continued. New calves were born, crops were harvested, and the old line shack was expanded into a comfortable way station that began to bring in steady income from travelers. Brielle and York's partnership deepened into friendship and mutual respect. They still disagreed occasionally. She thought he was too cautious with expenses. He thought she pushed herself too hard, but their shared vision for the ranch united them through every challenge. What Brielle hadn't counted on was how York had begun to infiltrate her thoughts even when he wasn't present. She found herself watching him when he was unaware, admiring the grace with which he rode or the concentration on his face when he was working through the ranch accounts. She wasn't the only one noticing the change. On a rare trip to town for supplies, Mary pulled her aside in the general store. "So," her friend said with a knowing smile, "how are things with your handsome partner?" Brielle busied herself examining a bolt of calico. "The partnership is working well. The ranch is finally starting to show a profit." "That's not what I meant, and you know it," Mary said, lowering her voice. "Half the town is talking about how York Calloway stays out at the Lazy K instead of taking a room at the hotel when he's in these parts." "Because it's his ranch too," Brielle said defensively. "And he stays in the bunkhouse with the other hands, not in the house." "MMHMM," Mary hummed skeptically. "And I suppose the way he looks at you is just business too." "How does he look at me?" Brielle asked before she could stop herself. Mary's smile widened. "Like a man dying of thirst and you're the only water for miles." "Don't be ridiculous," Brielle scoffed, though her cheeks warmed at the thought. "York and I are partners, nothing more, if you say so." Mary picked up a tin of peaches. "But I've never seen two people more suited to each other, and it's been nearly a year since your father passed. No one would think it improper if you were to pursue happiness." Brielle didn't reply, but Mary's words stayed with her long after they parted. Was there truth to what her friend had suggested? Did York see her as more than a business partner and friend? The question lingered in her mind as she rode back to the ranch, the wagon laden with supplies. The autumn landscape was ablaze with color, gold and crimson leaves drifting down from the trees that lined the road. It was her favorite time of year, when the hard work of summer gave way to preparation for winter. As she approached the ranch, she saw York in the distance, working with one of the new horses in the corral. He glanced up at the sound of the wagon and raised a hand in greeting, a smile spreading across his face. Something in her chest tightened at the sight. Mary's words echoed in her mind, like a man dying of thirst. Brielle shook off the thought as she pulled the wagon to a stop by the barn. There was work to be done, supplies to unload, cattle to check before nightfall. She didn't have time for romantic notions. But that evening, as they sat in the kitchen going over the books, Brielle found it hard to concentrate. York was sitting close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, could smell the clean scent of the soap he used. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, revealing strong forearms dusted with dark hair. "Brielle," his voice broke into her thoughts. "Did you hear what I said?" "I'm sorry," she said, flustered. "My mind wandered. What were you saying?" "I was saying the profits from the way station have exceeded our projections," he repeated, giving her a curious look. "Are you feeling all right? You've been distracted since you got back from town." "I'm fine," she assured him. "Just tired, I suppose." York studied her face for a moment longer, then nodded. "We've been pushing hard these last few months. Maybe we should take a day off. The cattle drive to Spokane isn't for another 2 weeks." The idea of a day with no chores, no decisions to make, was tempting. What would we do with a day off? "Whatever we wanted," York said, a hint of mischief in his eyes. "I've been wanting to explore that high meadow on the northwest corner. Pete says there's a waterfall up there." "Blackbird Falls," Brielle nodded. "Pa used to take me there when I was a girl." "It's beautiful, especially this time of year with all the colors." "Then it's settled," York declared. "Tomorrow we ride to the falls. No talk of cattle prices or fence repairs or horse training. Just one day to enjoy this land we've been working so hard to save." Brielle found herself smiling at his enthusiasm. All right, one day. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, perfect for riding. They set out after breakfast, packed lunch tied to their saddles, following the creek that wound its way up into the hills. The trail was narrow in places, forcing them to ride single file, but opened occasionally to reveal spectacular views of the valley below. "Your father chose well when he settled here," York commented as they paused to let the horses rest. "This is some of the finest country I've ever seen." "He used to say God spent extra time on this valley," Brielle said, remembering her father's words. "Said he knew it was special the moment he first saw it." "Smart man," York agreed, "though I think his greatest achievement was raising a daughter who loves it as much as he did." The simple compliment warmed her more than it should have. They continued riding, climbing higher into the hills until the sound of rushing water reached them through the trees. The falls came into view suddenly, a silver ribbon of water tumbling down a series of stone steps into a clear pool below. The surrounding maple trees were ablaze with autumn color, their reflection shimmering in the water. "It's even more beautiful than I remembered," Brielle breathed. They dismounted and secured the horses, then found a flat rock beside the pool for their picnic. The air was cool, but the sun was warm, creating a perfect balance. They ate sandwiches and apples, talking easily about everything and nothing: childhood memories, books they'd read, places they'd seen. After they finished eating, York stretched out on the rock, hands behind his head, watching the play of light through the leaves above. "We should do this more often," he said lazily. "All work and no play makes for dull ranchers." Brielle laughed, pulling her knees up to her chest. "Hard to imagine you being dull, York Calloway. He turned his head to look at her, his gray eyes warm. "Is that a compliment, Miss Kincaid?" "Perhaps," she admitted. "Though your head's big enough without me adding to it." York laughed, the sound echoing off the rocks around the pool. He sat up suddenly. "Can you swim?" The question caught her off guard. "Of course. Pa made sure of it after a boy drowned in the creek when I was little." "Why?" Without answering, York stood and began unbuttoning his shirt. "What are you doing?" Brielle asked, alarmed. "Going swimming," he said matter-of-factly, as if it were the most natural thing in the world to strip down to his undershirt on a cool autumn day. "Care to join me? The water will be freezing," she protested. "Probably," he agreed cheerfully, pulling off his boots. "But when's the last time you did something just for the joy of it?" Brielle couldn't remember. Since her father's illness, and especially since his death, life had been an endless series of responsibilities and worries. Even after York saved the ranch, they'd been so focused on making it successful that simple pleasures had been set aside. Something in her expression must have shown her thoughts, because York's face softened. "You don't have to," he said, "but I'm going in. Someone needs to test that water." Before she could respond, he ran to the edge of the pool and dove in with a splash that sent water droplets flying. He surfaced with a whoop that was half laugh, half gasp. "Cold," Brielle called, unable to keep from laughing at his expression. "Freezing," he confirmed, "but wonderful." "Are you sure you won't join me?" She hesitated only a moment before kicking off her boots. "Turn around," she ordered. York obligingly turned his back, treading water in the middle of the pool. Brielle quickly removed her outer clothing, keeping on her chemise and drawers. Before she could reconsider, she ran to the edge and jumped in. The cold hit her like a physical blow, driving the air from her lungs. She came up gasping, her body already numbing in the icy water. "You're crazy," she spluttered, pushing wet hair from her face. York was grinning at her, his own hair plastered to his head. "Probably. But isn't it exhilarating?" And it was. The cold, the weightlessness, the sheer unexpectedness of swimming in a mountain pool on an autumn day, it made Brielle feel more alive than she had in years. They swam until their lips turned blue, then scrambled out to dry in the warm sunlight on the rocks. Brielle wrung out her hair, conscious of how the wet fabric clung to her body. York politely kept his distance, giving her privacy as they both dressed. When she was fully clothed again, her hair still damp but no longer dripping, she found York sitting on a log near the edge of the pool, watching the falls with a contented expression. "Thank you," she said, sitting beside him. "I needed that." "We both did," he replied. "Sometimes I forget there's more to life than work." "Me too." She pulled her knees up, wrapping her arms around them. "My father was like that, always working, rarely taking time for himself, especially after my mother died." "He loved her very much?" York asked gently, "with everything he had?" Brielle smiled at the memory. Even years after she was gone, he talked to her sometimes, as if she were still there. He said the right kind of love doesn't end with death. "I believe that," York said quietly. "My father wrote to my mother every day they were apart during the war. She kept every letter, read them to me at night after he died. Through those words, I felt like I knew him, even though I was just a boy when he left." Brielle looked at him with new understanding. "Is that why you never married? Seeing how your mother grieved?" The question seemed to surprise him. "No, not exactly. I just never met anyone who made me want to risk it." Until he stopped abruptly. "Until," she prompted, her heart suddenly beating faster. York stood, moving to the edge of the pool. "It's getting late," he said, his back to her. "We should start heading back if we want to reach the ranch before dark." The moment had passed, leaving Brielle with the distinct impression that he had been about to say something important, something that might have changed everything between them. They rode back mostly in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The day had revealed a different side of York, more playful, more vulnerable, and Brielle found herself wondering what other layers there were to this man who had become so central to her life. As they approached the ranch, the setting sun gilded the buildings and fields in golden light. It looked prosperous again, well-tended and thriving. In just a few months, they had accomplished what had seemed impossible in the dark days after her father's death. "It's beautiful," York said, echoing her thoughts. "You've done your father proud." "We've done it together," she corrected him. "I couldn't have saved it without you." He looked at her then, something unreadable in his expression. "You would have found a way." "You're stronger than you know, Brielle Kincaid." The way he said her name sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with her still damp hair. They stabled the horses in comfortable silence, then walked together to the house. At the porch steps, York paused. "Thank you for today," he said. "It's one I'll remember for a long time." "Me too," Brielle said softly. He hesitated, as if wanting to say more, then simply tipped his hat. "Good night, Brielle." "Good night, York." She watched him walk toward the bunkhouse, a tall silhouette against the darkening sky, before turning to enter the house. Inside, she leaned against the closed door, her thoughts a confusing tangle of emotions she wasn't ready to name. The next 2 weeks passed in a flurry of activity as they prepared for the cattle drive to Spokane. The ranch hands worked from dawn to dusk, rounding up cattle, checking hooves, and ensuring everything was ready for the journey. York would lead the drive himself, along with 4 of the hands, while Brielle stayed behind to manage the ranch. It would be the first time they'd been apart for more than a day since their partnership began, and Brielle was surprised by how much she dreaded his absence. The night before his departure, they sat in the kitchen going over last-minute details. The lamplight cast a warm glow over the room, making it feel smaller, more intimate. "Pete will help you with the horses while I'm gone," York was saying. "And Jimmy knows which fields need to be cleared for spring planting." "York," Brielle interrupted gently, "I know how to run the ranch. I did it before you came, remember?" He smiled ruefully. "Of course you did, I'm just—" He trailed off, worried, she suggested. "Maybe a little," he admitted. "I've gotten used to being here, to working alongside you. It feels strange to be leaving, even temporarily." "I'll miss you too," Brielle said before she could second-guess herself. York looked up sharply, his eyes meeting hers across the table. "Will you?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning beyond the simple words. Brielle took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "Yes," she said firmly, "more than I probably should." York's expression softened. He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "Brielle, there's something I've wanted to tell you for a while now." Her heart hammered in her chest. "What is it?" He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, a loud knock at the door interrupted them. York withdrew his hand as one of the ranch hands, young Tom from Montana, stuck his head in. "Sorry to interrupt, boss, but there's a problem with the lead steer. Got himself tangled in some wire out by the east fence." York sighed, standing reluctantly. "I'll be right there." He looked at Brielle. "We'll continue this conversation when I get back," she nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. "It'll wait." But by the time York returned, it was late, and the moment had passed. The next morning, the cattle drive departed at dawn, with promises of a return in 2 weeks' time. Brielle threw herself into work during York's absence, refusing to dwell on what might have been said that night in the kitchen. She kept the ranch running smoothly, dealt with a wolf that had been threatening the sheep, and even negotiated the sale of 2 horses to a passing army patrol. At night, though, in the quiet of the house, she allowed herself to wonder. Mary's words came back to her about the way York looked at her, about pursuing happiness. And she thought about that day at the falls, the near confession before they'd ridden home. Was it possible that York Calloway felt for her what she was beginning to realize she felt for him? The 2 weeks stretched into 3 when bad weather delayed the cattle drive's return. Brielle tried not to worry, knowing that York was experienced and capable. Still, she found herself watching the road each evening, hoping to see riders approaching. Finally, on a crisp November afternoon, the distant sound of cattle and the sight of dust on the horizon announced their return. Brielle's heart leapt as she spotted York riding at the head of the small procession, tall and straight in the saddle despite what must have been weeks of hard travel. She wanted to run to meet him but forced herself to wait by the corral, maintaining at least the appearance of calm. As the cattle were herded into the holding pen and the tired men dismounted, York handed his reins to one of the hands and walked directly to her. He looked tired, his face weathered from weeks on the trail, but his eyes lit up when they met hers. "Miss Kincaid," he said formally, though his smile was anything but. "The ranch looks to be in fine shape." "It is, Mr. Calloway," she replied, matching his tone. "How was the drive?" "Profitable," he said. "Got a better price than we expected. The Lazy K is officially in the black." The news should have thrilled her. It was what they'd been working toward for months. But all she could focus on was the fact that he was back, standing before her, whole and unharmed. "You must be exhausted," she said, noticing the fatigue lines around his eyes. "I've kept supper warm. Why don't you get cleaned up and join me in the house?" York nodded gratefully. "Give me half an hour." True to his word, he appeared at the house 30 minutes later, freshly shaven and wearing clean clothes. His hair was still damp from washing, curling slightly at the ends. He looked younger somehow, less weathered. They ate at the kitchen table, York recounting tales from the trail while Brielle updated him on ranch affairs. It was comfortable, familiar except for the undercurrent of tension that hadn't been there before he left. After dinner, as Brielle cleared the plates, York reached into his pocket. "I brought you something from Spokane." "You didn't need to do that," she said, surprised. "I wanted to." He held out a small package wrapped in brown paper. Brielle wiped her hands on her apron and took it, carefully unwrapping the paper to reveal a small leather-bound book of poetry. "Tennyson," she said, running her fingers over the embossed cover. "You mentioned once that your mother used to read his poems to you," York explained. "I saw it in a bookshop and thought of you." The thoughtfulness of the gift touched her deeply. "Thank you, York. I'll treasure it." "There's something else," he said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "Something I've been thinking about the entire ride back." Brielle's pulse quickened. "What is it?" York stood, moving around the table until he was standing directly in front of her. "We never finished our conversation the night before I left." "No, we didn't," she agreed softly. He took her hand, his much larger one engulfing hers. "Brielle, when I rode back into this valley 17 years after your father saved my life, I thought I was just repaying a debt I never expected." He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "I never expected you." Brielle's breath caught in her throat. "What are you saying, York?" "I'm saying that somewhere between arguing over cattle breeds and teaching you to gentle wild horses, I fell in love with you," he said simply. "Deeply, completely in love." The words, spoken so plainly, struck her with the force of revelation. Not because they were unexpected, but because hearing them aloud made her own feelings impossible to deny. "When did you know?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "At the falls," he said. "Watching you laugh, seeing you truly happy for the first time since we met. But I think part of me knew from that first day, when you stood up to Hollister and refused to give up on this land." He brought her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "I don't expect you to feel the same. Our partnership can continue as it has if that's what you want." but I couldn't keep pretending that my feelings for you are purely business." Brielle felt a smile spreading across her face. "York Calloway, for a smart man, you can be remarkably dense sometimes." His brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean?" "I mean," she said, stepping closer to him, "that I've been half in love with you since you handed Hollister that bank draft and saved my home, and completely in love with you since long before that day at the falls." The joy that spread across York's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "Brielle," he breathed, his hand coming up to cup her cheek. She leaned into his touch, her eyes never leaving his. "I was so afraid to admit it, even to myself. Afraid of complicating our partnership, afraid of what people would say. And now," he asked softly. "Now I don't care what anyone says," she replied. "Life's too short to deny what's in your heart. My father taught me that." York's thumb traced the curve of her cheek. "May I kiss you, Brielle Kincaid?" In answer, she rose on her tiptoes and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but quickly deepened as months of unspoken longing finally found expression. His arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer, while her hands found their way to his shoulders, feeling the solid strength of him. When they finally parted, both breathless, York rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that since the day we rode to town to pay off the bank." Brielle laughed softly. "Longer," he admitted, "but that was when I first thought you might not object." "I wouldn't have," she confirmed, her fingers idly tracing patterns on the back of his neck. They stood in the warm kitchen, holding each other, savoring the newness of being able to touch freely, to express what had been building between them for so long. Eventually, York stepped back slightly, though he kept his hands at her waist. "I should go," he said reluctantly. "It's getting late, and the hands will be wondering where I am." Brielle nodded, though she was loath to see him leave. "Tomorrow," she said, "we should ride out to the North Ridge. There's a stand of pines there that would make good timber for building." York raised an eyebrow, a smile playing at his lips. "Always thinking of the ranch, Miss Kincaid." "Well," she said, returning his smile, "I was thinking we might need to build a larger house someday, if things continue in this direction." His expression grew serious, though his eyes remained warm. "Brielle, are you saying what I think you're saying?" "I'm saying I love you, York Calloway," she replied simply. "And I can envision a future where we build something lasting together in every sense." York pulled her close again, his kiss more urgent this time, filled with promise. "I love you," he murmured against her lips, "more than I ever thought possible." When he finally left for the bunkhouse, Brielle stood on the porch watching him go, her heart fuller than it had ever been. The night air was cold, winter's approach evident in the crisp clarity of the stars overhead, but she felt only warmth. The following weeks were filled with stolen moments between work hands touching as they passed tools, private smiles across the corral, long conversations by the fire in the evenings. They kept their relationship discreet around the ranch hands, though Pete's knowing smiles suggested they weren't fooling anyone. As Christmas approached, York suggested they host a dinner for everyone who had helped them through the difficult year the ranch hands, Mary and her family, even reluctant invitations to Hollister and his wife. "Are you sure?" Brielle asked as they decorated the house with pine boughs and candles. "Hollister isn't exactly my favorite person." "It's Christmas," York said, lifting her to place a star at the top of the small tree they'd cut. "Besides, I want everyone to see how well the Lazy K is doing, especially those who doubted it could be saved." The dinner was a tremendous success. The house was filled with laughter and conversation, the table laden with food from their own harvest. Even Hollister seemed to enjoy himself, particularly after York mentioned the possibility of expanding their operations in the spring, which would require additional financing. After the guests had gone and the hands had returned to the bunkhouse, Brielle and York sat alone by the fire, content in each other's company. "I have something for you," York said, reaching into his pocket. "I was going to wait until Christmas morning, but I find I don't have the patience." He withdrew a small velvet box, and Brielle's breath caught. "York, Brielle Kincaid," he said, taking her hand. "When I rode into Lewiston last spring, I was looking to expand my ranch holdings. I never expected to find the other half of my heart." He opened the box to reveal a simple gold ring set with a small but perfect diamond. "Will you marry me? Be my partner in life as you've been in business?" Tears filled Brielle's eyes as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, with all my heart." York slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into his arms for a kiss that sealed their promise to each other. They were married on New Year's Day, 1886, in the parlor of the Lazy K Ranch. Mary stood as Brielle's witness, while York's foreman from Montana had traveled down to stand with him. The entire town seemed to turn out for the celebration that followed, eager to witness the union of two people who had defied the odds to save one of the oldest ranches in the valley. As they danced their first dance as husband and wife, York whispered in Brielle's ear, "I have one more surprise for you." "Another one," she laughed. The ring and the wedding weren't enough. In response, he led her to his saddlebags, which had been brought into the house earlier. From them, he withdrew a legal document sealed with a ribbon. "What's this?" she asked, taking it from him. "Open it," he urged. Brielle broke the seal and unfolded the paper. As she read, her eyes widened. "York, this is the deed to the Lazy K with only my name on it." He nodded, his expression serious. "I had my lawyer draw it up in Spokane. The ranch is yours, Brielle. It always should have been." "But our partnership," she protested. "All the money you've invested, the money was to repay a debt to your father," York said. "But more than that, it was because I believed in you and this land. I don't need my name on a deed to know that we're partners in every way that matters." Tears filled Brielle's eyes. "I don't know what to say." York took her hands, the deed still clutched between them. "Say you'll still let me help run the place," he said with a smile. "That you'll still argue with me about cattle breeds and irrigation systems. That you'll build that future we talked about with me, on this land that means so much to both of us." "Always," she promised, rising on tiptoes to kiss him amidst the cheers of their guests. "Always and forever." Epilogue, Spring 1890. The sound of children's laughter echoed across the yard as Brielle watched from the porch of the new house York had built for them. Their 3-year-old son, James, was attempting to help his father saddle a pony, his small hands barely able to lift the blanket. Beside her, in a rocking chair, sat York's mother, who had moved to the Lazy K after their wedding. At 70, she was still spry enough to chase after her grandson and help with light household duties. "He's the image of his father at that age," Alina Calloway said fondly. "Same determined look when he's set on doing something himself." Brielle smiled, one hand resting on her swollen belly where their second child grew. "Stubborn as a mule, you mean, like his father." "And his mother," Alina added with a knowing smile. The ranch had flourished beyond their wildest expectations. The breeding program York had established was producing horses sought after throughout the Northwest. The cattle herd had tripled in size, and the sheep provided wool that commanded premium prices. The way station had grown into a small trading post that served travelers heading to and from the mining districts. But the greatest joy for Brielle was watching York with their son, teaching him the same love of the land that had brought them together. York looked up, catching her eye across the yard. He said something to James, then lifted the boy onto his shoulders and walked toward the house. "Mama," James called excitedly. "Papa says I can ride Pepper all by myself tomorrow." "With supervision," York clarified as he climbed the porch steps. He set James down, and the boy immediately ran to his grandmother, eager to share his news. York came to stand beside Brielle, his arm slipping around her waist. "How are you feeling today?" he asked, his hand gently covering hers on her belly. "Strong," she said, leaning into him. "The doctor says another month at most." "Boy or girl this time, do you think?" York asked, the same question he'd been asking since they learned of the pregnancy. "Girl," Brielle said confidently. "To balance things out around here, too many men already." York laughed, pressing a kiss to her temple. "As long as she's as strong and beautiful as her mother, I'll be content." They stood together, watching as Alina helped James collect eggs from the chicken coop, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the yard. "Did you ever imagine this?" Brielle asked softly. "That day you rode into Lewiston, did you ever think this would be your life?" York was quiet for a moment, his gaze taking in the prosperous ranch, their growing family. "No," he admitted. "I came looking to repay a debt and expand my holdings. I found something far more valuable." "What's that?" she asked, though she knew the answer. "Home," he said simply, drawing her closer. "The home I've been looking for since that day your father found a frightened boy and his mother stranded on the trail." Brielle turned in his arms, looking up at the face that had become as familiar to her as her own, at the eyes that still looked at her with wonder after 4 years of marriage. "I love you, York Calloway," she said. "Thank you for saving my home and giving me yours." "I love you, Brielle Calloway," he returned, bending to kiss her. "Thank you for letting me come home." As the sun set over the Lazy K Ranch, painting the sky in the same brilliant colors that had first captured York's imagination as a boy, they stood together on the porch of the house. They'd built two people who had found in each other the missing pieces of themselves, creating a legacy of love that would endure for generations to come.